Pedestrianized streets, linear parks, and bollards. Lots and lots and lots of bollards. But like a lot of European cities, Madrid wasn't always like this. All about what Madrid has done to tame the automobile and lessons we could learn from it in the US if we choose to learn, coming up next. This is City Nerd, weekly content on cities and transportation. Viewer suggested topics always welcome, and just being honest, no one had any reason to ask for this. By the way, you might have noticed my studio is in a different location than usual. I'm gonna be mobile for a good amount of time, which is just, I guess, how I am. If you've been following this channel, you know I've been living in the Vegas area for the last year, which was great fodder for a whole bunch of content, but if I'm being honest, the American Sunbelt really wore on me. I had a craving to be back in a dense, walkable city again, and you can find those kinds of places in the Western Hemisphere, but man, I just developed a serious craving for some Spanish-style urbanism. Or maybe I should say Castilian style, and so it just had to be Madrid. Here's the thing though, Madrid has not always been a great walking city. Like a lot of European cities, it had a very car-centric period in the mid to late 20th century, and it's been a difficult road, excuse the metaphor, just extricating itself from that. I'm going to talk about all the moves the city's been making to rectify things, but let's start by looking at a couple recent high-profile changes. First, the city's main shopping street, the Gran Via, which is sort of like a mashup of Fifth Avenue and Herald Square if you know New York. The Gran Via itself isn't car-free yet, but a lot of the adjoining streets are, and here's something I love. If you go back just a couple years, this was a wider street with narrower sidewalks, and if you move the time slider up, you can see they took out a couple of the lanes and widened the sidewalks. What's funny is, anytime you see something like this proposed in the US, what you'll always hear is, if you restrict motor vehicle access, it's gonna negatively impact local businesses. Well, they did a before and after study on Gran Via and found that after the improvements to the pedestrian realm, retail spending on the street increased by almost 10%. Amazing what happens when you make a street a more pleasant place to be. The other place we can look at is what I guess is the city's main square, Puerta del Sol. Again, you only have to go back a couple years to see what it looked like when cars had unlimited access. Well, the city studied it and found that a significant amount of the traffic in the area was taxis and ride hails, and that 70% of them were deadheading, meaning it was just the driver circling the area looking for people to give rides to. Well, that's no way to run a transportation system, so Puerta del Sol has been gradually pedestrianized in recent years, and right now they're overhauling the whole thing to make it pedestrian only. So making a city more people-centered isn't something that just happens by itself. You need leadership and an initiative that comes from the very top. And in this case, maybe we're really talking about the city needing to come into compliance with the EU's air quality objectives, but all the strategies were developed locally. And the package of strategies that are being implemented now, including the pedestrianization of Puerta del Sol, is called Madrid 360. It includes a lot of measures to curb vehicle traffic and improve transportation options, including designated low-emission zones in the central part of the city, which historically has had the worst air quality in Madrid. Vehicles here have to display an emissions sticker. Zero-emissions vehicles have the fewest restrictions on circulation and parking, while vehicles rated B and C are more restricted. And if you're an A, you can't even enter central Madrid, which is why I couldn't find any A stickers for this video. What's more striking though, and it really goes hand in hand with the vehicle restrictions, is the ongoing pedestrianization of the busiest parts of the city. You could be forgiven for thinking it's always been this way, but for a lot of the last century, many of the streets we're looking at had unfettered motor vehicle access. For much of the last century, the car was assumed to be the silver bullet that was going to improve everyone's quality of life, and planners and engineers assumed that's just the way people were going to want to get around. So the streets were designed that way. Sound familiar? Well, some of these are old streets that are now being returned to pedestrian-only status, but some are relatively recent transformations. Let's look at Calle de Fuencarral as it passes through the Chambéry neighborhood. This street was already pretty good for pedestrians with wide sidewalks and lots of cafe seating, but I think during COVID, they decided to just close the street entirely. And I think the new configuration of the street was so popular, even after pandemic restrictions started to be lifted, that people just didn't want to give it back. Now, it could be that people just wanted high quality pedestrian access to the world's smallest IKEA, but I think more to the point, this really says something about the power of quote unquote temporary or pilot projects. Give people something they love and they don't want to lose it. Anyway, you might ask, does it cost a lot to make a street car-free? Well, you can spend a bunch of money on streetscaping and put up signs and put down some paint. But really, in the case of Fuencarral, maybe all you need is some police tape from a party supply store. There's just a lot of pedestrianized space in this city. And this is a country where people like being outside, even apparently in winter. Madrileños, in particular, just seem to like being around each other. Observing that as an American, it's just very weird behavior. So I'm gonna do something different now and just stop talking and let you all just immerse yourselves in the sounds of car-free streets. Think of it as ASMR for people who are way too into cities. Okay, here's something else. A street doesn't have to be completely pedestrianized to be pedestrian friendly. So let's take a moment to give proper appreciation to the majesty of bollards. They really narrow down the envelope of a street, and I guess you could say they provide physical protection. But I always feel like the bigger thing is they make drivers slow down and pay more attention, because who wants to get their car all dinged up? You see these kinds of treatments in a lot of European cities, but not so much in the US. You know, I once worked on a project where the transit agency proposed putting bollards in at a bus platform at a location where the street happened to be under state jurisdiction. And the state DOT wouldn't allow it because of the risk that a car might hit it going like 50 miles an hour. So it was considered an injury risk and a liability. I just submit to you that if you've got 50-mile-per-hour traffic driving in close proximity to a heavily used bus platform, you should probably spend a little more time thinking through what the problem actually is. One final thing on pedestrianization. I do always feel like the #1 indicator species that tells you you're in a walkable city is newsstands. But I'm sort of old, so take it with a grain of salt. There are other ways to make your city more pedestrian friendly, and I am a fan of just removing freeways altogether, but it's not easy, and Madrid didn't do that with the M30. It's still there, but they did bury it and reclaim the space for a truly great linear park, the Madrid Rio. The park mostly runs on both sides of the Manzanares River, and you have a variety of pedestrian-only bridges, both old and new, that make for great connectivity no matter how you're getting to and from the park. Anyway, this is footage from this past Saturday, and there were just an astonishing number of people out walking, running, biking, rollerblading, or just sitting outside chit-chatting, as Madrileños seem to like to do. The land uses along the Rio are interesting. There are tons of bike shops and running shops, and there's density along the river. A lot of it's been there for a long time, but there's more on the way. When I was here a few years ago, I took this shot where they were in the middle of demolishing the Vicente Calderon Stadium, former home of Atletico Madrid. Today it's completely gone, and there are a whole lot of cranes. The park is a lot busier too. I mean, this is a sunny Saturday, so maybe it's an unfair comparison. I don't know. When you create a great public space like this that didn't exist before, and a ton of people start using it, do we call that induced demand, or was the demand really there all along and something like the Madrid Rio just revealed it? I just think it's always easier for elected officials and agency directors to just muddle along with the status quo and remain blissfully ignorant of how truly transformative projects like this can be. I'd love to see more of this kind of thing in the States, but at least Madrid's getting it done. Okay, in a second I'm going to get into the number one thing that enables all this stuff: motor vehicle restrictions, people-oriented streets and public spaces. And it is a very obvious thing, but it needs to be said. But first, the usual reminder that if you're getting even a modicum of value out of this content, drop a like on the video, subscribe, and activate notifications if you want this kind of nonsense to show up in your feed every week. All the usual ways to connect on the various apps if you care to. Patreon is great if you want to support the channel directly, or if that's too much commitment, there's a well-concealed tip jar on YouTube. Okay, here's the thing. It's very tough to do all the things Madrid is doing if you don't have rock-solid transit, and Madrid does have that. So if you've been following my channel from the very beginning, you know I'm kind of bananas for the iconography of the Madrid Metro. I don't always find the metro stations in other cities super identifiable. Sometimes they're tucked away at building entrances, or they just don't announce themselves. I never have that problem with the metro stations here. They just jump out and grab you, but without overwhelming the surroundings, which are often lovely. As far as the stations themselves, they're functional. Not the most amazing headways, but good, and maybe more importantly, does your local subway station have a library branch? I do like the Opera metro station, which, while you're hanging out waiting for the train, has, I don't know if it really qualifies as opera, but the vibe is pretty sweet. You know, I'm thinking about starting a second channel that's just urbanist ASMR, so then I don't have to think up a bunch of words to say every week. Anyway, here's Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response, Madrid Metro Edition. And finally, I talked earlier about how Madrid was once a much more car-centric city. Well, this old cartoon I saw on one of the trains illustrates the point really well. If your Spanish is as bad as mine, here's what I think is a rough translation in US English. Construction of the first metro line had begun in 1917 without a license from City Hall, which was not convinced that putting a train down in a hole in the ground was a brilliant idea. But by the time construction was finished in 1919, City Hall did grant permission for the train to begin operation. With the opening of the metro came an influx of people from the countryside into the city. Hordes of peasants? I think the words here aren't even that nice. Couldn't quite believe that a trip of almost 3 miles from Puerta del Sol to Cuatro Caminos could be done in 8 minutes, and they flocked to buy tickets in large numbers. The ticket was relatively expensive. I'm not gonna give you the literal translation of Pere Gorda, you can look it up. But the thrilling vertigo of the speed was considered well worth the price. And so, the unstoppable exodus from the hinterlands had begun. Today, presumably 1984, I think that's the date of the cartoon, the ticket costs 30 pesetas and the countryside is depopulated. Now you go to the present day panel and you just get this dialogue balloon of someone yelling to a driver while running into the metro station amid a traffic-choked streetscape. And I think the translation is, yeah, I'm gonna take the train because I would actually like to get home quickly. A sentiment which is, I think, just evergreen. And that's all I've got. Thanks for joining today, and thanks as always to the patrons who, I don't want to say they funded this trip to Spain. since it's actually cheaper to be here than to be in most of the US. But I did have to put all my crap into a storage locker and buy a plane ticket. The upshot is I'm going to be mixing in some on-the-ground content from overseas with some of my usual stuff. And I do hope that's a plus for people who watch the channel. Keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new episode next week, and I'll see you then.